the tax bill, which is making its way through the conference committee now, there is a number from Public Citizen, the watchdog group, of over 6,000 lobbyists working on the tax issue in 2017. Some subset of those directly impacted the tax reform bill, the Republican tax reform bill. And of course, if you look at the provisions included in that bill, it's clear that they had a very important influence. Go through some of the highlights, some of the pieces of the tax reform legislation that the lobbyists who represent these special interests, a whole slew of special interests, were able to insert into that measure.
And it's really quite typical of what any big piece of legislation. What happens when you have any piece of legislation that affects big banks or wealthy investors? They're the ones who are going to be at the table and who are able to write the checks to pay for the lobbyists who actually do the writing of the legislation.
Literally
writing,
language.
and we saw. I think we saw an image of some pages with handwritten notes, and you can almost rest assured that probably was written by some lobbyist. This legislation would give corporations a big tax break, for one thing, and that's probably the biggest giveaway. We do have a high corporate tax rate,
35%.
Exactly, but corporations don't pay anywhere close to that,
given all the loopholes and deductions in the tax code.
But one of the big problems with that was the insertion of this measure that would do away with the individual mandate in the Affordable Care Act. That's one thing. That's very problematic. But the whole thing is very, very problematic in that, as we're seeing, there's no doubt that if this is passed and we have these cuts in taxes, the next thing in the Republican sights will be the Medicare program and Social Security and other so-called entitlement programs.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that because, we've argued for a long time that the way the Republican playbook works is they spend, in this case, $1.45 trillion on tax cuts, mostly for very wealthy individuals.
Right.
They blow up the budget, in this case, by $1 trillion over 10 years. And then they turn around and argue, the deficit is so high, we can't afford programs like Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. We need to slash that funding.
Yep.
It's what they did during the era of George W. Bush when he passed 2 tax cuts that blew up the deficit and then tried to privatize Social Security. And they are being quite honest about it now, with Paul Ryan arguing that they're going to have to turn to entitlement reform, or as they call it, welfare reform, and go after those programs, despite, of course, the president, when he campaigned, pledging not to touch those initiatives. Does it surprise you how blatant they are, that this is ultimately the plan, that the corporations and wealthy are going to do well, clearly, and their donors are going to be pleased, and then everybody else, well,
it doesn't surprise me now how blatant they are, because they are clearly doing what their donors have instructed them to do, and those donors will make a lot of money, and they'll have even more money that they can spread around to help those Republicans run their candidates again in 2018 and 2020 and going forward. So I think they feel pretty confident that they can pull this off for their donor base and to fulfill some of their ideological pledges, like cutting Medicare and Medicaid, some of their goals for many years, and to continue to do some of the efforts that they've long tried to do, like privatize the Medicare program, for example. I think we'll start seeing that back again.
A Paul Ryan dream, really.
And the guy who's going to be the next head of HHS is on board with that. One of the things that he has done in his fairly recent past, he served as treasurer of this organization called the Healthcare Leadership Council, which comprises all the big industries in healthcare, and they've had a goal for a long time of privatizing Medicare. So I think we'll see a lot of that effort go on in the next year or so.
And let me ask you about the healthcare piece of this. You mentioned it, that the Senate version of the tax bill eliminates the individual mandate that is the requirement to purchase healthcare coverage. It's the mechanism by which young and healthy people are brought into the risk pool and premiums go down for everybody else. And the Congressional Budget Office found that you get rid of this provision, you see premiums increase by 10% at least. 13 million people lose coverage over a period of 10 years. Now, the insurers who've been participating in Obamacare since 2010 are opposed to that provision. Are their lobbying efforts just falling short here?
I think they're falling short. In fact, I think some of the big insurers, they don't care. Most of them have dropped out of the individual marketplace. Cigna, for the most part, United, Aetna, Humana, Anthem still is in most markets, but the big for-profit companies have already gotten out of the market, so they just don't care. AHIP, America's Health Insurance Plans, the one of the trade associations for the lobbyists.
Yeah, and so influential, we should mention, during the crafting of Obamacare.
Exactly. They were very influential then. But they're not as powerful as they once were because a lot of those big companies have dropped out of that organization. They're freelancing to a certain extent, and they have the ability to do that. The big companies don't really care, and AHIP doesn't have as much power as it once had, as I mentioned. And I also... that market is really not important to a lot of those insurers. It's relatively small. The profit margins are fairly thin, even for those that are making money. So keep in mind, insurers don't really want to take you as a customer if you're not pretty healthy. And people in that pool of people often are among the least healthy. And they know that their coverage is just not affordable for a lot of people. Yeah. And they don't have a lot of expertise selling in that marketplace, the big companies in particular. When I was at Cigna, Cigna had a very, very, very small presence in the individual market. So one of the reasons you're not seeing them around as much is they don't care a lot. Plus, they are not too unhappy with this overall legislation because they will benefit.
Yeah. And is it because most of those dollars, I mean, I guess it depends on the company, but most of those dollars are made in the employer with employer health plans.
Exactly.
And I'm sure there's like Medicaid's a piece as well.
There's those two. In fact, the overall market has been stagnant for a long time. It just simply is not growing.
Yeah.
The big companies grow by stealing market share, which is a term that I've used a lot and that has been going on for a long time. But the business that they want is serving as administrators of self-insured plans, the big employers, and they're making a lot of money on the Medicare program through the Medicare Advantage program, which has grown a lot. They advertise a lot. They're able to bring a lot of customers into their programs, and they've been able to figure out how to make that profitable. Mm-hmm. And the Medicaid program too. Now, that's one area where they have some concern that state budgets or the overall Medicaid program might be cut, which could cut into their profits. But big insurers actually administer most of the Medicaid programs around the country.
Little known fact,
Yeah.
actually. Yeah,
Right.
exactly.